All right, well, welcome to tonight's Autism 200 series lecture. This is Autism 208, How to Access and Implement ABA Services in Schools. We're very excited to be talking to you tonight about some background information about the current state of applied behavior analysis practices in our school systems, as well as an overview about what some of those services may look like in the schools. So we're also going to highlight the new school behavior analyst credential and how to effectively advocate for services, including ABA, in public schools. My name is Elizabeth Hatzenmuller. I'm a board certified behavior analyst and I work for Seattle Children's Autism Center, and I'm joined tonight by Arzu Foro, who is the executive director of Washington Autism Alliance and Advocacy. We will reserve some time at the end for audience members to ask some questions and have some discussion. So please submit your questions in the comments. And in addition, given our current climate and changes to the school year, Arzu also is happy to answer some questions throughout her section of the presentation. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. All right, so to give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about, I'm going to start off by first just spending just a few minutes talking about what is ABA, or Applied Behavior Analysis, and then we're going to move on to looking at some ABA-based school assessments. We'll then look at what the continuum of implementing ABA services and strategies into schools can look like, because there are some different options for doing so. And then I'm going to end my section of the presentation on talking about parent and teacher training, because that's such a central component to all of this. After that, we're going to briefly pause so that we can connect with you and hear a little bit from you guys in terms of the children you have and what ages they are or what settings you are currently in, because that will help us to better answer some of your questions moving forward. And then we're going to jump back in and finish the evening with Arzu presenting on the access and advocacy components of this. All right, so what is ABA? So applied behavior analysis is the science of behavior change. It's the science of learning. And what we're looking at are relationships between behavior and our environment and how those create changes in us every day. And that's how we're learning. So one example I like to give people is how you might be more likely to drive to a specific Starbucks location if you know that that particular location makes the Starbucks drink that you really love in the most perfect or your most favorite way. So you have learned to drive to that location and are more likely to drive to that location in order to get your drink made the correct way. That's just a quick example of one of the basic principles that we use. And again, we use these principles to help teach and increase new skills and decrease challenging behaviors. And using these principles, what we do is we systematically apply them in the interventions we develop to purposely see if we can change behavior. And so, for example, we might implement an intervention, see that it's making a positive change in the behavior, and then we know to continue to use that intervention. Or we might implement an intervention and then see, oh, well, it's really not making the change we had hoped for, and so we need to make an adjustment somewhere. So it's really that simple, systematic application and process that I want you to be thinking of. I will also just note that this is a very brief overview of ABA. If this is new content for you, we absolutely have other resources that can help you dive into the details of some of this and explain it in more depth. One thing that I always like to bring up with people is that one of my most very favorite parts of ABA is that it can really be applied in a very broad manner. And so sometimes we have this idea that we automatically associate ABA with autism, but really ABA is for everyone. It's for you, it's for me. It's how we learn all of our behaviors, and it's been implemented in a variety of areas. This is by no means an exhaustive list, But just to give you a couple of ideas, there are behavior analysts that go in and do organizational behavior management and look at helping to improve individual and group performance in companies. Or there is ABA that is applied to medical procedures to help people be more compliant with taking their medication, things like that. And of course, I've also listed education on here because that is going to be our primary focus for this evening. So while ABA can be used for all people, we also know that it's demonstrated a lot of effectiveness in the application to autism. And the way this works is that we use ABA to help kids and their families to improve the core symptoms associated with autism spectrum disorders or other developmental disabilities. And so this may involve learning and skill development and assistance in a variety of domains, including social skills, communication skills, play, behavior, adaptive, motor, or cognitive skills. One other thing that I always like to mention too is that ABA is a collaborative process. It should never be a standalone service because the idea behind it is that the more expertise that we pull in, the better we're able to service that individual or that child. So again, a very quick overview, but just keep in mind moving forward that we're thinking about a very systematic application of some basic learning principles to help improve behavior. It's something that can be applied to anyone, but it's also demonstrated to be very effective with autism. All right, so we're going to jump into some ABA-based assessments in schools. And I want to keep in mind that based on our current climate, there are many components of school that have changed for us this year. But again, we can talk about ways that these could potentially be implemented. And certainly Arzu will follow up in her section about the current state of those. All right, so there are three main categories or types of assessments that we really want to be looking at. Those are functional behavior assessments, ecological assessments, and then skills-based assessments. So a functional behavior assessment is a systematic method for collecting information to determine the purpose or the function a behavior serves for a person. So we're really looking at trying to figure out what that person is gaining out of that behavior. And these assessments are completed using a variety of methods. So we might use some indirect assessment measures, so things like interviewing family members, doing some checklists or rating scales. Of course, we want to be taking some direct assessment measures by directly observing the behavior and recording data on it. And then sometimes we also will look at doing what's called a functional analysis. And this is when we are directly testing to see if our hypothesis or what we think the purpose or function of a behavior is actually in fact what is happening in the environment. And the reason we do that component of a functional behavior assessment is because we know that our interventions are going to be more effective when they're directly tied to the need or the purpose that individual engages in them for. I will just throw one note out there that there are FBAs that can be completed by different people, but you really want to make sure that you have a qualified provider completing your functional behavior assessment, because there are differences in the ways that people are trained to do these types of assessments, and that could impact your child's progress. And I know Arzu is going to talk a little bit about that as well too. So once we have gone through the process of the functional behavior assessment and figured out why we think the child is engaging in the behaviors, we use that information to then create a behavior intervention plan. So a behavior intervention plan, you might also hear this called a BIP, is a written description that summarizes and lists out the steps that need to be taken to help a student obtain success in the classroom or whatever environment you're working with them. And so some things that it might help to identify are our hypotheses, so our predictions of why we think the behavior is happening from the FBA, and those are used to help create appropriate replacement behaviors. So for example, we might go in and think that a child is engaging in a challenging behavior because they're looking for attention. And so an appropriate replacement behavior might be that we teach them to raise their hand to appropriately gain attention, or to say, excuse me, to gain attention. And so again, that's how we're pulling in that information from the FBA to help inform the skills that we're going to be teaching. We're also going to list out antecedent strategies. So what are things that the team can do before a behavior happens to help decrease the chances that it's going to happen if it's a challenging behavior, or to increase the likelihood that a behavior is going to happen if it's a skill that we want to see more of, like raising your hand. We're also going to look at teaching strategies that are going to help support the learning of those replacement behaviors, in addition to consequence strategies. So sometimes even with the best laid plans, a challenging behavior might occur, and it's important that the team knows how to address the behavior after it happens. So once you have written up a behavior intervention plan, the next step is to make sure that you obtain consent from the team and determine what the implementation plan should be. So what is the training going to look like for the individuals that are responsible for carrying this plan forward? How is data going to be collected? Because again, remember, we're making those data-based decisions to determine if what we're doing is working. We're going to also want to know how the team is going to determine when changes are needed, and how the team's going to know when the behavior intervention plan is no longer needed. So another big takeaway of this is that the FBA and the BIP process is continuous. So this is a living document that should be updated and modified or amended as needed in order to continue to help the child succeed. Another type of assessment that can be done in schools is called an ecological assessment. And so in this type of assessment, we are gathering information about how a child functions in different environments or settings. And this can include a lot of different variables, but a couple of examples would be physical factors in the environment, so things like seating arrangement, noise, lighting, maybe specific interactions with others. So for example, maybe the child does well with certain teachers, but not other teachers, or does well in certain groups of peers, but performs less well with others. Maybe interactions with different seatings arrangement or environments. So sometimes kids will do better in reading compared to math. And we also would look at collecting data to compare our student with a typically developing student in order to determine some benchmarks about where we think our student should be performing. So for example, if we were to go into a specific class, let's say math class, we might look at, on average, how does a typical student, how long do they attend for, and compare that to how long the student we're working with is able to attend for, and then determine what other variables or factors might be impacting that. So we go in and we collect all of this information, and then that data is then used to help drive new learning targets and come up with appropriate accommodations and modifications. So again, maybe a new learning target is that we want to increase time on task during language arts. Or maybe an accommodation and modification would be a certain instructional format or a seating arrangement or visual supports, things like that. The last type of assessment that is helpful to have done are called skills-based assessments. So these assessments look at measuring a child's skill set in a particular area, so things like cognitive skills or social communication skills. And they help us to identify things the student really does really well with, and then what are some areas that maybe are impacting or impeding learning. And so we would then use those to help drive IEP goals and objectives and look at coming up with some more teaching targets for the child. So I've written you a list of what some of the common ones that you might hear about are that are specifically, commonly referred to or heard about in ABA treatment. So things like the Verbal Behavior Milestones Assessment and Placement Program, or the VB Map, it's probably familiar to some of you. The Assessment of Basic Language and Learning Skills, also known as the ABLES, or the Assessment of Functional Living Skills, which is known as the AFLS. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about assessment and we've figured out different ways that we can collect the information about how to best support a child, now we have some decisions to make about how we actually implement those services and strategies into the school setting. And so there are several different ways that this can be done. I've spent some of my time as a behavior analyst consulting for school systems, and it's been a very neat experience and collaboration to see how this can work. But before I jump into some of those details, I want to talk about some common myths of ABA, because for some of us, we think that ABA is strictly a home-based intervention, and that's just not true. ABA can be really wonderful in the home, but ABA can also be very successful in center-based programs and very successful in the school setting. Another one I hear a lot of is ABA is always one-to-one instruction, and again, that's also not true. ABA can absolutely be done in group settings and has been proven to be very effective in those. This one makes me kind of laugh and cringe at the same time, but often I hear ABA is discrete trial training. That is definitely not true. DTT is a strategy or a way we can help teach certain skills, but it is not ABA. I've also, another myth that we hear about is ABA is only used to suppress challenging behaviors or coping strategies that kids might use. And again, our goal is really to teach kids skills so that they have a variety of ways of coping with things and learning to acquire skills so that they can live a happy and healthy life in whatever way is meaningful for them. Another one I've heard a lot of is ABA cannot be applied in integrated school settings. I hope that we all learn that that is not true after the next set of slides. ABA uses aversive techniques. Of course, there is history and people have had aversive experiences with ABA, but just like any other field, we have continued to evolve and develop better practices. And so, years ago, there were potentially some aversive techniques that were used, and people had bad experiences with them. But those are things that we are always looking to improve upon. And at the time, it was potentially the best science we had and the best information we had. And so, again, we've evolved a lot from those days. The last myth is ABA is only effective if a child receives a certain number of hours. Again, that's also not true. Certainly, there is research and data to support that especially in early intervention, we want kids to get a lot of support so we can help shift that trajectory from them at an early age. But I also like to balance that, and this is something I tell my parents all the time, is that some is going to be better than none. And so there are absolutely strategies and principles that we can be implementing and integrating into our school systems for all children. That's just going to look at elevating our level of teaching and our ability to help provide effective services for kids. All right, so what does ABA look like in schools? What can it look like? So I want you to think of this as a continuum where there are school-wide supports and models, there are classroom supports and models, and then of course there are individual services. I think sometimes people are more familiar with individual services and think of it as that one-to-one support from a behavior technician or something like that. But again, we can look at the application a lot more broadly in order to help support all learners. So in terms of school-wide supports, one of the things that you might hear of is positive behavioral interventions and supports. And this is also referred to as PBIS, but it is a evidence-based three-tiered framework that helps to integrate and improve all the different data collection systems and practices that we're using to help positively impact student outcomes so that all students can succeed. And so if you look at this diagram over to the right, that first tier is for all students. So those are school-wide positive expectations and behaviors that are taught to all students. And one way that I've seen this integrated really nicely is when schools have monthly assemblies where they specifically teach kids what some of those positive expectations and behaviors are, and the kids have an opportunity to practice or talk about them. But again, the idea being that all students are accessing that content. Now, let's say there's a child who needs a little bit more support than just the monthly assembly or the information being given to all students. And so that's where we might see students move up into that tier 2 section of the diagram where it says some. So this is when students are not quite successful in tier 1 on their own and they need additional support. And then of course, if there are students who need much more intensive services and individualized support, that's where they might fall in that tier 3 category. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this. So here's a tier 2 example. There is something called a check-in, check-out behavior intervention, also referred to as a CHICO. So this is a strategy that helps just hold students accountable so that they can be successful throughout the day and hopefully move back into tier 1 where they don't need additional support. The idea is that they have some sort of card or point system, such as the one I showed you on the right, where they check in with a coach or mentor at the beginning of the day, to set or review their goals. So for example, on this card, you can see goal number 1 is to respect others. And so at the beginning of the day, the child comes and checks in with their mentor, and their mentor might practice with them or talk to them about, what does it look like to respect others? How are we going to know you did that today? Or tell me one way you can practice or show me that you're working hard. And then throughout the day, the teacher might help to evaluate those daily goals and give the child points. And then at the end of the day, a parent or sometimes the mentor will review that card, sign off on it, and the student earns points that they can eventually exchange for something else. So moving into some classroom-based supports and models. So again, some of these might look at both some of that, those tier 1 or tier 2 supports where they fall in, depending on how broadly they're applied. But there's been 2 different models that I have found to be both very successful. One is when there are classrooms that just can be behaviorally based and utilize strategies that are known to work well for all learners. So things like providing clear expectation and routines, or visual supports and schedules. Those things are going to help all learners succeed potentially. Or using something like a group reinforcement system, which I'm going to show you an example of in a moment as well. So that's one model. Another model that I've seen work well is when there are specific ABA-based classrooms where those ABA supports are integrated more heavily into the routine. So for example, that classroom might be following an ABA-based curriculum like direct instruction. Or there might be a different level of staffing where it might include some additional one-to-one support. And in these models, there might be both group and individual reinforcement systems. Here's an example of a classroom-wide behavior management system. This is probably a familiar one to many of you, but this is a traffic light system. And so the idea behind it is that every morning, all kids start on green. So you can see there's clothespins, and those are clipped to the green smiley face. And throughout the day, their clothespin might move as a way to signal where they are in terms of their behavior. So if they don't need any warnings during the day, they stay on green. If they need one warning, they might move to yellow. If they need multiple warnings, maybe they move to red. But the idea being that rules and consequences are taught proactively to students. And I say that and emphasize proactively because sometimes where I see these systems fall short is when we are not providing the students and the children with the teaching and the consistent teaching they need around how to be successful with this. So one way that I found this to work very successfully is when teachers spend a few minutes during their morning meeting or something like that, talking about or sharing ideas for how do we stay on green today? Or if we have a problem, how are we going to resolve that during the day? Or if you are somebody who has a really hard time focusing, can you identify an appropriate coping skill that might be helpful when you're feeling that way so you don't move to yellow? So again, these things are practiced and taught and reinforced over and over. And the reinforcement is tied to the success of either the individual or the group. So sometimes kids might earn stars for staying on green, and then when they have a certain number of stars, they get to exchange those. Or if all students in the classroom can stay on green, maybe they get extra recess time, something like that. Moving into individualized ABA support, again, these are going to be those tier 3 supports, and these are going to be for all learners who need that intensive level of service. So again, we've done some assessments that identify individual goals to address behavior, and a child likely has a behavior intervention plan, and this is something that must be followed. And it includes those antecedent strategies, the skills that need to be taught, consequence strategies that are going to be appropriate and helpful. There's training that's provided to the teachers and support staff on the specific behavior intervention plan. And those are things that, again, there is a continuum within the individualized support. So sometimes when a child is receiving this type of service, they might get some pull-out services or more of that one-to-one time, but it can also occur in the general ed setting because, again, we want to look at transitioning kids back to their least restrictive environment. I just want to note that there are certainly other ongoing assessments that can be done school-wide and classroom-wide. Some of the other assessments before were really thinking about what are the assessments that are going to be applicable for those really intensive or individualized levels of support. So here's a couple of common examples you might see, and I'm going to move through these a little bit quickly for the sake of time, but a common one that can be used is a visual schedule. So these help learners to better understand what is expected in a given moment or anticipate changes that might be occurring. They're also a really nice way to help increase independence with transitioning and some executive functioning tasks. So think of it as giving a child a checklist of what they might need to do ahead of time to be ready for reading, or what they need to do when they walk in the classroom in the morning, such as hang up their backpack, take out their homework folder, go find their book, and meet on the carpet. And visual schedules can be modified to fit any learner's individual skill set. So this example shows you some visuals, but it can also be used with written text. Another common one is using token systems. So this is a reinforcement system where a learner earns tokens for a correct response. And so once they earn all their tokens, or in this example, once they earn all their stars, they exchange those stars for a backup reinforcer. So maybe it's a break, or a special toy, or extra time at recess, or whatever is going to be really motivating for that child. And some advantages of using a system like this are that they can be reinforced to reinforce many different behaviors. They're resistant to satiation. So what that means is that students are typically motivated to continue to work for their tokens because they can exchange them for lots of different things. You can kind of think about it in the same way that we use money. Lots of us are motivated by money because money can provide us a house or a car, or food, or getting our nails done, or whatever we're motivated or really desire in that moment. It also can be a nice way to provide some visual feedback and reminder to the learner about how close they are to earning their reinforcer and staying on track with work. Another just quick example is the use of contingency maps. So these are a type of visual strategy that helps a learner better understand a behavioral consequence. So we know that oftentimes kiddos with autism can have a strength in using visuals, and that can help support comprehension. So the idea of this is that you have these visuals that tell you what your reinforcement is for engaging in the appropriate behavior, or what's going to happen if you don't engage in the appropriate behavior. So in this example, my work expectation is that I need to use a quiet voice and complete my work. And when I do that, I get a break. Or if I'm yelling and I don't do my work, I'm not going to get my break, and I'm going to have more work to do. All right, so those are a couple of just examples of some individualized supports that you might see being used. But I want to move on and talk briefly before we take a bit of a break about parent and teacher training. And so this is going to be an extremely important and central part of this whole process, because this is where we're going to really focus on maintenance and generalization of skills. And so just a couple of quick notes about parent training is that parents should be receiving training on any of the recommendations in a behavior intervention plan. Using behavioral skills training, meaning that somebody is going through a very systematic way of telling you what needs to be done, showing you and modeling that, and then practicing that skill with you until you have it mastered. And then sometimes what's also been really nice and what I've seen been really successful is when parents are able to come and do classroom observations. And of course, this depends on the goal and this depends on the child, but it can really help to facilitate additional training opportunities and some really reciprocal collaboration. So for example, in the past, sometimes when parents have come into the classroom, having that visual model of how to implement a strategy is super helpful, but then also it's an opportunity for the parent to give feedback about how they think that might work or not work in the home setting, which can also really help to inform what the team might look at training, doing or training in the future. Some commonly taught skills for parent training are things like functional communication training, because those are usually good replacement behaviors for challenging behavior. Also approaches to handling different functions of behavior. how to implement visual schedules or supports, and then also reinforcement strategies. So oftentimes we talk a lot about making sure that we're following through with good contingency, meaning if we're going to set clear expectations and then we're going to follow through. And so some additional coaching and training on those nuances can be really helpful in increasing and improving the success of the child, both at school and at home, because again, we really want to make sure that what the child is learning at school, they're able to transfer to other environments. And just a couple of quick notes about teacher training. The first being that professional development should be provided to teach any of the school-wide supports and models. So in the past, we've helped to run some of these professional development days for teachers so that they can practice the implementation and figure out how to make that work the best for their particular school system or classroom. I've also spent some time training groups of teachers and paraprofessionals just in order to build capacity in various classrooms. So sometimes it hasn't been the case that I'm working specifically with one student in that classroom, but rather I want to help build that capacity in the teachers and paraprofessionals that are working all throughout the skills, all throughout the school, to better equip themselves with the skills that they can use and tools that they can pull from their toolbox in order to apply to all learners. And then last, of course, BCBAs should be training teachers and paraprofessionals, any related service providers, so speech and language pathologists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, anybody who is a part of that child's team, including the behavior technician, on that individualized behavior intervention plan. So again, training should occur at that school-wide level or could occur at that school-wide level if that's something the district is considering doing. It can occur more broadly to help train teachers and paraprofessionals about some basic strategies that are going to be really effective for all learners. And then, of course, that really individualized training on specific behavior intervention plans. All right, so just quickly, some final thoughts to summarize all of that content. The first is that ABA is a science of behavior change, and it can be applied in a whole bunch of different contexts. So I hope you can reflect on some of those myths that I was talking about earlier and see ABA in a little bit of a different light. We should start by determining appropriate supports by doing some really good assessment in a variety of different ways. And then once we have done our assessments, we can look at how we implement all of these supports within a school-based setting for all learners. So throughout the school, throughout classrooms, and for those individualized, more intensive levels of support. And again, training and collaboration with parents and teachers should be central to any ABA treatment. I always say that parents and teachers end up knowing these children the best and are really strong advocates. And it's really, really helpful to us as clinicians to be able to hear what they feel like works well, what's realistic, what's not realistic, so that we can work really collaboratively to best meet the needs of that child. All right, so I'm going to pause there and stop sharing my screen. All right, I think that did it. And then we just wanted to just take a brief moment to kind of hear from you guys in terms of what age your kiddos are, what your current setting is, or Arzu, I don't know if you've already seen some of the questions and we want to jump into that, but we can take a few minutes for that, and we can also just jump into your section as well. So one of the questions is, will you be addressing how to implement ABA online? So I know that content didn't necessarily touch on that, but there are certainly ways that we could be thinking about doing this in the virtual classroom and helping to reinforce different contingencies or using some of those behavioral management strategies with the class, or still holding a morning meeting that could potentially help to teach a child an appropriate skill and practice that and that sort of thing. So I don't know that we have time to go through every detail about how each one of those things could be done in an online format, but I certainly believe that there are ways for us to look at doing that and thinking creatively about how we navigate and work on implementing these in the virtual school setting before we're able to come back in person.
My name is Arzu Foro. I'm the parent and a parent of a 24-year-old on the autism spectrum. And I want to thank you for spending your Thursday evening with us. Looking back at my son's um, education experience, I remember that he had the most success when um, his ABA, his most positive school experiences were shaped by highly competent board certified behavior analysts who worked closely with his teachers, paraeducators, and behavior technicians. And again, I want to thank you for sharing your Thursday evening with us. These are really challenging times for our students of all ages and their families. A little bit about Washington Autism Alliance and Advocacy. Our mission is to extend access to healthcare and education for services with people with on the autism spectrum and related intellectual and developmental disabilities. And today, our focus is going to be effective services in schools. We hope that by you being here today, you can have more clarity about special education services and take away some tangible tips that will help you advocate for your own child or student. Even if you don't have a child with ASD, the things that both Liz and I talked about today are generalized enough that they can apply to you as well. And please feel free to ask questions along the way as we go. Next slide, please. Today, I will talk about the school behavior analyst certification and who can develop functional behavior assessments and develop behavior intervention plans, some general advocacy tips for parents and how we can help, as well as general education resources. Next slide, please. In Washington state, certain specialists who serve in the K-12 schools are certified as education staff associates, ESAs. This allows school districts to employ these specialists as certificated staff. Prior to the current school year, the only way school districts could hire board certified behavior analysts is if they were also certified teachers. And in Washington state, there are very few BCBAs that hold both these certifications. In July of 2019, after significant advocacy by a small group of us, the Professional Educator Standards Board approved school behavior analysts ESA certification. Next slide, please. One of the salient details here on this slide is that licensure through the State Department of Health is not required to be certified as a school behavior analyst. And I'll talk a little bit later about why licensure is significant. Next slide, please. Liz spoke in detail about FBAs. I'll just add that an FBA is generally considered to be a problem-solving process by addressing problems of concern. An FBA looks beyond a diagnostic label or a way behavior looks in order to obtain information that can be used to maximize effectiveness and efficacy of behavioral supports. And a central reason for conducting an FBA is to obtain information about when and where a challenging behavior occurs in order to determine why. In many school districts, the school psychologist serves as a behavior specialist. However, only school behavior analysts have had comprehensive, in-depth training on how to conduct FBAs and develop behavior intervention plans that are backed by science. Next slide, please. Over the years, I've observed the reason school districts have been reluctant in utilizing ABA as part of school-based services is due to funding constraints. They don't know how to seek reimbursement for these services. The School-Based Health Services Program is an optional Medicaid program that provides reimbursement to public school districts, education service districts, charter and tribal schools for Medicaid-covered healthcare services provided to Medicaid-eligible children requiring special education services. These services must be included in the student's current IEP or an individualized family service plan and must be provided by or under the supervision of a licensed healthcare provider. ABA is not presently included in the school-based healthcare services program. Next slide, please. So if these services are not funded by the school-based health services, then how are they funded? School districts can contract directly with managed care organizations or MCOs for applied behavior analysis. And the school behavior analyst must be licensed by the State Department of Health in order for schools to bill MCOs for their services. Next slide. We all know that individuals with ASD and IDD can learn. We also know that best practice guidelines recommend that remediation programs that are effectively designed and delivered by the medical community, therapy providers, families, schools, and other providers working together in achieving consensus. If one of these systems is missing or broken, much like this crib mobile, the whole mobile will break. In order for a student with autism to succeed and thrive, all these systems play an integral and interconnected role. This is why parent and teacher training is so vital to make sure that all these systems, the family system and the education system, are working in consensus. I often hear from parents that things that happen in school don't happen at home or vice versa. And sometimes there's breakdown in communication between home and school. And it's the student that suffers as a consequence. So I can't stress enough that all of these systems play an integral and interconnected role in a child's success. Next slide, please. In order to effectively advocate for ABA in schools, we have to first understand the IEP process. The purpose behind an IEP is to ensure that children who experience an adverse educational impact due to an existing disability and therefore require specially designed instruction are provided with a program that is individualized to meet their unique educational needs and that it will enable them to make progress. As the parent of a child receiving services through an IEP, it's essential that you learn how to be an effective advocate. How do you do that? Well, the best way is to start by understanding the different components of an IEP and the special education process. Next slide, please. One of the best opportunities you have as a parent is to share your concerns about your child's education with the rest of the IEP team. There's a section titled Team Considerations right under the strengths of the student and the concerns of the parent for enhancing the education of the child. Often I see IEP case managers type information here instead of the parent. This is your spot. Before any IEP is written, I recommend typing up a letter describing your child's strengths and what you're concerned about, and then kindly request that this be added to the IEP in this section. Most IEP case managers will gladly honor this request. Next slide, please. This portion of the IEP could contain certain baseline data about your child's abilities in any of the areas they qualify for special education services, including information from direct observations, assessments, private providers, teachers, and parents. These are some of the areas typically covered in a present levels of performance. Of course, they will vary depending on individual needs of each student. This is where data from ABA assessments that Liz talked about can feed directly into the IEP. In the general education, how much support does your student need to make reasonable gains in general education? Is he or she learning all the contents? What kind of obstacles do they have? For social and emotional, how is your student doing with friendships? How are they doing working in groups? What kind of challenges do they have at recess? How is their self-esteem at school? For adaptive, how can he or she independently function at school? What does he or she need help with? For behavior, does your student drift off or daydream? Are there concerns about aggression? How is your student's frustration tolerance? Do they have any work avoidant behaviors? And for cognitive, how is your student's natural learning capacity without any supports? Does he or she struggle with learning, and what does that look like? With academic, how does your student struggle with basic learning activities in reading, writing, math, or science? How much academic support does he or she need? What kind of modifications would make your student's life easier? And does he need help learning new concepts? And then with communication, this includes not only receptive and expressive language skills, but also social communication. Next slide, please. It's these baseline scores in assessments that go into creating SMART goals. There has to be at least one goal in each qualifying area for your student to receive special designed instruction. Most importantly, goals should be SMART. They should be specific, they should be measurable, there should be action words, they should be realistic and relevant, and they should be time limited. If a goal is unclear to you, be sure to ask the case manager questions such as, how are these skills going to be taught? When will my son or daughter receive this instruction? How often is data collected? And who is collecting this data? This is also a good time for you to bring up, how often will data be shared with you, so that you can not only stay informed of their progress, but you can also be ahead of any obstacles in learning. It's really important for you to monitor your child's progress, because if he or she is failing to make expected gains towards a goal, then you want to meet with the IEP team to discuss what can be done differently. And if we're only getting data from school once a quarter, that's too long to go before you can address any shortfalls or any supports that your child is not getting. This is especially important during the pandemic. And there's also um, it sometimes different in perspective of what is adequate progress. And so this understanding how the goals are written, and understanding how to write goals and how to measure progress is really key. Next slide, please. The accommodations and modifications are very important to ensure your child's ability to have equal access to curriculum and be successful at school. Whether this is through digital learning or in-person instruction, it's these accommodations and modifications that ensure that your child is successful. What can be changed to help your child succeed? What supports does he or she need? Having the accommodations and modifications written into the IEP is intended to guarantee that your student will receive these supports. Remember when Liz was talking about strategies for supporting your children in the classroom, in the school as a whole? As she aptly noted, some of these examples could include preferential seating, chunking of information, availability of a scribe, shortened assignments, positive reinforcement systems, frequent breaks, and a one-to-one adult support. These are just some of the examples. Next slide. Some general advocacy tools for parents: inform your school district about the school behavior analyst certification. This is very new, it's new this year, and many school districts might not be aware of it. Also, inform your IEP teams about the full continuum of services that a school behavior analyst can provide in schools. There might be misconceptions about what a school behavior analyst can and can't do. You can help educate your team. Also, have your private providers who work with your child write letters with educational recommendations for you to share with your IEP team. Next slide. The prior written notice, this name can be a little confusing. This is a written decision provided to you anytime your district is proposing or refusing to initiate change in the identification, evaluation, placement, or any provisions of a free and appropriate public education to your students. This will accompany any evaluations, the IEP, possibly a request that you made for a particular service that you want your child to receive at school or during digital learning. The prior written notice should include statements describing what was considered, whether it was rejected or accepted, and the reason why. And as a member of the IEP team, you should be involved in any decision regarding the services your student receives. Sometimes you might disagree with the school's decision. If this is the case, be sure to write a letter stating your disagreement and ask that it be attached to the prior written notice. Next slide. Next slide. Before a student can receive specially designed instruction, he or she must be deemed eligible through an appropriate evaluation. These evaluations can be comprehensive and include any area of suspected disability. Evaluations must be done at least every 3 years, but they can be done as frequently as once a year. If you feel a new evaluation is needed because your child is struggling at school, be sure to write out your concerns and email your request to the entire IEP team. You can request an evaluation at any time. However, if it's been less than one full year, both you and the school need to agree that an evaluation is needed. Sometimes we as parents feel that our student should qualify for services even when the school says they don't. If this happens, email the school psychologist and ask why your student didn't qualify for services. And again, if you disagree with their reasoning, you can ask them to send you their district's policy on eligibility. If you're unable to convince the team to provide a service that your child and that your student needs, and you continue to disagree with the team, then you may also utilize dispute resolution options. Next slide. In 2015, we passed a law in Washington that limits the use of seclusion and restraints of all students to only when there's imminent risk of harm. Since then, ABA has been the preferred intervention that has allowed school districts to limit or altogether avoid the use of restraint or seclusion to manage interfering or dangerous behaviors at school. More and more schools are opting for restorative justice and ABA rather than punishment. Next slide, please. Some general advocacy tips. There are some simple things that you can do that help you be a more effective advocate for your child. One is staying organized, keeping all your files in the same binder. I like to have tabs for evaluations, IEPs, meeting notes, progress reports, letters, etc. This will help easily locate past files when it's needed. I also keep a digital copy of everything on my Google Drive so that I can easily share with specialists who need to see them. I keep original paper copies neat and clean. If I need to write notes on something, I make a copy first. Also, it helps to be prepared at meetings. Ask for drafts beforehand so you can review and come prepared with any questions that you have. Also, email the team any issues that you would like to discuss before you meet so that you can be prepared to be an active participant. Next slide, please. During the meeting, take notes for your records. And you can share this with the team afterwards to ensure that you're all on the same page. Invite your child's ABA therapists if they feel they would be helpful so that they can talk to the team about what they've observed or what to work on. And if you feel like there wasn't enough time to finish the discussion, you can ask to reconvene the IEP team and meet at another time. Politely inform the rest of the team that you will gladly sign the attendance sheet at that time. And if you disagree with the rest of the IEP team, be sure to note your disagreement right next to your signature on the attendance sheet. Next slide. After any meeting or phone call, be sure to email the team thanking them for their time and for listening to your concerns. And then this is also a good opportunity for you to document what was discussed and any decisions that were made at that meeting or on that phone call. Next slide. At any time, have private ABA providers who work with your child write letters with educational recommendations for you to email to the school. Type up your concerns and request that they be added to the IEP. Always communicate in writing. If you're making a phone call or having a meeting, follow up and capture what was said in writing and share your concerns with the entire team. And if you run into any problems, call upon your resources. And then remember that kindness and politeness goes a very long way. Some of the ways that we can support you and your family, we provide a range of advocacy services to help adults, youth, and children throughout Washington access health benefits, special education, and other needed supports. Our family navigation team is focused to support the entire family to improve access to multiple systems of care, including healthcare and education. Our training workshops provide practical information about everything from regulations governing insurance and education benefits to how to enhance your relationship with your child. Our special education legal library provides comprehensive collection of relevant Washington administrative code and guidance documents. And our insurance portal provides practical information on navigating private insurance, Medicaid diagnosis and treatment, as well as encouraging your employer to add autism benefits or ABA benefits, working with insurance case managers, as well as a program called the Premium Payment Program and more. And our resource directory provides every resource from where to obtain an autism diagnosis and interventions to financial and legal advocacy. Next slide. I've included a link to our special education legal library, as well as an autism IEP supplement that was adopted in Washington State in 2009, as well as a link to an upcoming training workshop that is very, very comprehensive. It's much more comprehensive than what I've provided today. Next slide. If you need to make a referral to WA, there's a button on our website that says join today. We also can be reached via our phone number, and line 1 is our intake coordinator, and this is her email as well. And then some additional resources in Washington State. Next slide. Thank you. The Office of Education Ombuds, the governor's OEO, provides information to parents and students and can serve as a neutral third party between families and public schools. The Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction has lots of information about special education. On their website, they have a very helpful Q&A about the provisions of special education during the pandemic. And then Office of Civil Rights as well. With that, I would love to answer any questions.
Arzu, I see one question here. It's about once an appropriate IEP is established, people are curious about what that looks like given our current climate and what the contingency is for virtual learning. So could you speak a little to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, it's it's hard to answer this very broadly, but depending on what the student needs, if they are able to independently access their services through the online digital platform, then that's great. However, if they're going to need extensive intervention and support by a person, then that in-person instruction can also be provided on on a case-by-case basis, and the both the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction as well as the Department of Health have made it clear that that can also be provided.
Great, thank you. Another question was about if you could speak further about licensure for teachers or para support and how, like, where's the best way to find that information?
Absolutely. It's the the PESB, it's Public Education Standards Board, has information on credentials for licensed behavior analysts. And licensure for behavior analysts and information on how to become licensed is on the State Department of Health website. You can do a search for applied behavior analysis and licensure, and that will take you to the Department of Health website. And they have pretty extensive information on how to become a certified behavior technician, as well as what it takes to become a licensed behavior analyst.
Wonderful. Next question is, how do you suggest getting ABA into your child's classroom or even into the IEP goals? My son is 3.5 and will be 4 in January, and he is in ABA currently in home. Hopefully he will be going back to developmental preschool shortly, and I think his ABA tech would actually be very beneficial to his long-term learning.
If this were me and I was if I'm advocating for my child to have access for ABA, I would share all of the progress that my child is making at home and share the rate of progress with the school team and demonstrate that this has been possible with access to ABA, and that with accessing a school behavior analyst and having that support in school, that my child can continue to make the same rate of progress. I see another question here. My child is 20 years old, has needed behavior support since preschool for a variety of reasons, has not received ABA services. One of the services is location. During the era of COVID, can we locate a BCBA who can provide services to his school and job coaching agency remotely? That's a great question. Telehealth has made it possible for people throughout Washington state have access to applied behavior analysis. One of the silver linings has been that most agencies have sprung to action and have become very mobilized in digital supervision of behavior technicians. They can offer consultations on various platforms to school personnel as well as supported employment agencies.
Thank you. Another one here is SPS ever required to provide ABA at SPS expense?
Seattle Public Schools, um, it's, can you put the question back on there? Okay, so it's it's not easy for me to say, is a school district required to provide ABA? ABA is one of the services that can help a student succeed at school. Whether they are, whether there are adequate providers within SBS, Seattle Public Schools, to meet the needs of every student with distance learning, I can't answer that. I know that there are challenges right now to bring staff safely back to school, as well as accessing providers of all disciplines. Um, you said it meets it's seems that SBS can't meet the obligations to students. My best advice to you would be ask to convene an IEP team to address how your students' individual needs can be met in school, and document everything that all of the ways that your school responds to your requests. If you're not able to come to an agreement, and if you think that they're not fulfilling your son or daughter's IEP, then come back to us at WA, and we can review that together on what your next steps could be. During virtual learning, can a student get one-to-one support in small groups, such as monitoring and feedback? My daughter has severe ADD, gets extremely sidetracked. Yeah. So yes, if before the pandemic, your child's IEP called for one-to-one support, then this would be the time for you to request how in-person one-to-one services can be provided safely to your child and the staff. This would be the time for the IEP team to gather and look at everyone's needs, including the support personnel, and what they need to do in order to safely provide that in-person support. Because it requires school requires afternoon live online classes in school, and giving me a really hard time with this suggestion. Um, I'm a little unclear about the medical sleep problems. I'm unclear whether this means that they are not able to sleep, and so they're not able to stay awake during the day. I'm going to answer it with that assumption, and feel free to repose your question a different way. If your student needs frequent breaks or extended breaks because they're not able to sleep at night and they need that longer break time during the day so that they can catch a nap, that they absolutely can be given that opportunity. And if that doesn't work well with the schedule that they're proposing, then the team can come together and tweak the schedule so that it can accommodate that. One-to-one would be one-to-one in all environments, and that's understood. My child was in public school when pull out and now is in full-time childcare. Um, if you're asking if one-to-one can be provided in childcare, um, I don't know how to answer that unless childcare is part of your son's IEP. Then I really don't know how to answer that. It's usually the education program is separate from the childcare that's provided either before or after school. Here's another question. The last time we attempted to achieve ABA in classroom through my son's IEP, we were told that we were required to try schools non-BT first, a year or even two, and compare progress of their plan to the in-home ABA. Only if it was slower progress would they consider. What should we have done to require it? Um, I One of the things that I've always asked from our school team is to use research-based, evidence-based, and science-based modalities. if they can justify what they're providing is research based and evidence based, and your son is indeed making appropriate progress in school, and they're willing to share um, and work in collaboration with your private IEP team, then I think that would be a great start. As long as the team is willing to review home progress and are willing to provide um, very frequent data from school to your home ABA team, then I think that that's a great start for you to start looking at how the progress compares in different settings using different modalities. On our website, there in our special education law library, there is a section that is specific to ABA. We have a lot more resources on how to negotiate for ABA and how to access ABA in school. Um, I think there's a question about how often can you ask for progress data. You can ask for raw data daily. You can ask for progress data weekly or monthly. It should be based on what kind of data is helpful to you. If you can get data weekly and then come together as a team monthly to review the monthly progress. And if that provides you with meaningful information in a way that allows you to monitor progress regularly and make sure that there's adequate momentum in meeting the goals, then that's great. I think anything longer than a month is too long. That's just my personal experience with my children's IEPs. Think second part of the question is I'm hoping for a resource to cite when I ask for more frequent data. I don't think it's going to be hard to ask for daily progress notes and um, more formal progress on all IEP goals once a week or once a month. If you have if you have specific obstacles with this, feel free to contact us at WA and we can provide more support. Virtual learning outside the home, children with IEP without one-to-one raw data or progress data during this, fine. Any suggestions on what to specifically ask for social emotional during the pandemic? This is a really great question and a tough one to answer. These are really difficult times for all of our students. But what I would be looking for if my child was at school during this time is how is my child's self esteem? Are they engaging in all of the things that they were interested in? Are they coming to the monitor willingly? Are they happy to see their teachers and classmates through the monitor? Are they attending to their classmates or staff through the monitor? If these are yes, then those are all positive signs. But if they're no, and you're noticing that there's more avoidance or more challenging behaviors or more difficulty with self-regulation, these are reasons for you to come together with your team and address some of the social emotional learning. There's a question that says, why are schools not offering support to the parents with kids with special needs? How come daycare is open and schools are locked down? You know, that is such a great question. And I have not been able to get a good answer to that. I have said repeatedly that therapy providers, mental health providers are available outside of school. I don't understand why the equivalent of those providers are not available in school. There's a couple of blog posts on our website on this as well. I don't have a good reason why, when care providers are able to work with people with developmental disabilities outside of school, when those same equivalent of those categories of providers are no longer able to offer these services. There's a question that says, my son goes to a private school contracted with school to provide some services that provide, let's see, my son is in a hybrid and goes to childcare some days, and they're also contracted with school district. My son's IEP calls for one-to-one support. Can we request and have the support from the school district or the private school? It's hard for me to answer this without knowing exactly what the one-on-one support is for in the school. If it's for them to participate in public school during to access their IEP services, then you could ask for the same services to be provided in I don't know about I can't answer that for private school. That's a question that's above my um, knowledge base. We do have people on staff that can answer that question for you. But in general terms, I can say that if your son or your son's IEP has one-to-one instruction for them to um, participate on the IEP objectives, then you can request for the one-to-one services to be considered on a case-by-case basis if it can be provided safely to both your son and to the staff. And there's another question. You discussed the importance of being evidence-based. I'm just aware that a lot of evidence-based for ABA is done by researchers who have background in ABA already. Can you point me in the direction of evidence-based that's non-biased and is reliable? That's probably a good question for you, Liz.
Yeah, so that is a really great question because it can be confusing. There's conflicting information out there, certainly. One thing that we will say is that there are some really great books and resources that will identify specific curriculums. And sometimes when you research a curriculum that a teacher might be using for your child, you should be able to go onto that website and read some of the research that's on it and talk to the teachers about what they know to be evidence-based. There are lots of journal articles and those types of things. So the big journal for applied behavior analysis is called the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. That has a lot of great information in it. But I also know that we have a list of books and things that we find helpful for our parents. I'm wondering if maybe we can gather that list and provide that as a resource as well. All right. So I think we are just out of time right now. Thank you again for joining us tonight. I know these are unprecedented times and we are all navigating new waters. But I just also want to say thank you to Arzu. You are a wealth of information, and so we really appreciate having you as a resource as well. And thank you for the team for putting this together. And thank you for all the teachers and parents out there really doing an awesome job pulling together right now. So please feel free to reach out and let us know if you have additional questions that we can be helpful with following this talk.